Hey again, everybody. Dr. here, continuing our discussion on industrial location theory. We were talking about transportation last time, how important that is. Obviously, labor varies from place to place. Does it cost the same everywhere? No, absolutely not. In the U.S., different states have different regulations on labor, things like the minimum wage, right? So obviously, labor is more expensive in a place. It sort of depends on what your factory is or what your business is. But if you were going to be using low skill labor, like minimum wage work, you would be more, you might be more likely to open in a state with a lower minimum wage. It would be less costly. Different states have different laws and regulations regarding using unionized work, and unionized work tends to be more expensive than non-unionized work. So, were I a business owner opening up a factory, and the main goal is to keep costs down, you might be more interested in setting up a shop in a state that didn't require you to use unionized labor. So that would be one consideration. The other question is labor equally available everywhere? No, of course not. There are more people in urban areas, and so particularly if we go back and look at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, one of the reasons why factories were all built in the cities, why? Because that's where all, virtually all of the labor was. People always ask, well, can't you get people to move to, your new facility? And yeah, things like that can happen. But in general, there is more labor, in urban and suburban areas. And because of that, you tend to see firms and factories cluster in those places. And that brings us to our next idea, this idea of agglomeration. Agglomeration is this concept that, and we talked about this a little bit in our chapter on urban geography. Agglomeration is this idea that in urban areas, you get sort of this synergistic effect of people working, not necessarily working together, sometimes working together, but not necessarily, and creating a system that allows for growth and external growth outside of a firm. What that means is, well, think about it this way. Think about that question there. Does it make sense to be located near your competitors? If we think about industry as a competition, we always have this sort of innate thing. Well, you don't want your competitors to spy on you, right? And that makes sense. And for some industries, that certainly makes sense. If you're making something top secret, or you're making something, highly innovative that you don't want people to steal. Obviously, you don't want to be right next door to your competitors with all your windows open and workers quitting your company and going to work for them and things like that. But for most types of industry, that risk is outweighed by the benefit of being located in an area where there are some of your competitors, because no firm exists in a bubble. Every firm has to use external firms. And if there are already some of your competitors in a city or in a region, it's very likely that some of the resources that you would use are already in that region. Let's say, for example, I make industrial chemicals, and in my manufacturing of industrial chemicals, I have to use let's just say I have very complicated accounting processes that require the services of not just your average accountant. Let's say there are specialized people that do accounting just for my type of business. If there are already some businesses in the region that are doing that, it makes sense that I would be able to use them, right? I wouldn't have to go far and wide searching for this service. Let's say, for example, if I am building, oh gosh, what can I build? That's a good example of agglomeration. Let's say I'm a car manufacturer, and I don't make all of the parts that get used on my car. For example, GM didn't make its own master cylinders. Master cylinders were used to control hydraulic pressure, make sure the brakes work. So General Motors got them from a manufacturer that just made master cylinders. So General Motors would buy the master cylinders from this company. If I was opening up a car company, it makes sense for me to be located, because if I'm going to use master cylinders and I'm not going to make my own, it makes sense for me to be located kind of right there near General Motors, because this external industry, which is called an ancillary industry of people making master cylinders, is already located right there. So when I order my master cylinders, I'm not going to have to pay a lot more to get them from halfway across the country. I'm not going to have to waste a lot of time when shipping and things like that. Agglomeration means that there's a benefit to being located near your competitors, and that there's obviously a transportation component to that, but there also could be a labor component to that too. If I'm opening up a new car manufacturing plant, I might be able to steal some of the employees or former employees of GM, people who know how to work the machines that I'm going to use, people who understand the processes of building cars, people who are already trained in those sorts of things. So agglomeration means that there's kind of a benefit. But for all these things, it's important to understand that the firm or the business or the factory or whatever it is that's opening up has to weigh the benefits of being located near the market or far from the market, being located near this labor pool or located near that labor pool, or being located near the competitors or far away. And they will weigh those things out in what's called a cost-benefit analysis. And a good business will have a very, very detailed cost-benefit analysis before they undertake any sort of big, important facilities building or restructuring or things like that. Okay, so let's excuse me. I'm sorry about that. I hate coughing into the microphone. Let's talk about the American Rust Belt, because the American Rust Belt is the big visible impact of industrialization and economic geography in the U.S. It's economic geography because, as we're going to see here, this region came to embody everything that was industrial and largely for a century. It was the economic engine of the United States, but that has changed. And as such, the meaning of this region has changed. So we already mentioned that industrialization spread into the U.S. before the Civil War, but it really, right around the time of the Civil War, it took hold. And it took hold in this region of the Northeast and the area around the Great Lakes. Similarly to why it happened in Britain, it happened in this region because there were great resources, natural resources, coal, iron ore, all kinds of things that were needed for industry in this region. So it made sense to build the factories near the resources that we needed. And there were great transportation networks already here, right? The Great Lakes themselves are sort of a man-made, a great pre-existing highway system, right? Shipping boats would have been easily moved about the Great Lakes region on there. And there were also a great number of navigable rivers. If you look at some of the biggest Rust Belt cities, they developed along the Ohio River and some of its tributaries. So the Rust Belt, as we now refer to it. Wasn't always called the Rust Belt. Back around World War II, it was referred to as the Arsenal of Democracy, because the importance of the factories that were located all along in this region were important not only to the economy of the U.S. Before that, and the world before that, really, but during World War I and World War II, these factories were marshaled by the United States government, and for example, car companies in Detroit stopped making cars and started making tanks and airplanes and things like that. This region was critical to the American economy, to the American military effort, and to the American identity as, you know, who we were. After World War II, this part of the United States, and it extends out beyond where this yellow is. It goes through Chicago, goes out to St. Louis, down to Louisville. This region was absolutely critical to who Americans thought that they were. We made everything for the world during that period of time, and we made it here. And if you go back and look at people's videos of the 1950s, one of the reasons things were from an economic perspective, you know, the things were booming. You saw the growth of that middle class was the manufacturing that was happening in here, and all the economic development in the service sector that was enabled because of all that manufacturing right here. Those quote unquote good times went into the 1960s, and then we saw some real cracks begin to happen in this region. And Youngstown, Ohio is the great example of that. It's it's seen as sort of the beginning of the end of this region in terms of its manufacturing greatness. This is a picture of a huge steel mill. I forget the name of it. I can't remember right off the top of my head. It's a big, huge steel mill, and it was one of dozens of big, huge steel mills in this region that closed its doors. There were two actually in Youngstown, one in, I think, 1969, the other in 1977, that they closed their doors. And when they closed their doors, they essentially shut down an entire town. For people who were living in those towns back then, the idea that they could get a high school diploma, not think about college, but graduate, go to work at the mill, make a great deal of money compared to today, what someone would make with just a high school diploma. They could have a stable job, make good money, have a house, have a car, have a good middle class life. That's what life was in towns like Youngstown and all these other Rust Belt towns. Today, Rust Belt, they weren't. Why did these steel mills and all of the other industries eventually leave there? Well, it comes down to that idea of costs. In the 1970s, Richard Nixon opened up China we opened up each other's markets, which meant all of a sudden companies that were building steel in Youngstown could build it a lot cheaper in China. The entire globalization process that we've talked about all semester really accelerated post World War II, and all of a sudden it became. At first, it just became economically possible for companies to build stuff overseas. And then in the 1970s and 1980s, it became socially acceptable. In the 1960s and early 1970s, it wasn't okay for Americans to drive a Toyota or a Honda. It was, in many towns, you might get beat up if you were driving a non-American car. But by the 1980s, that had changed. And we all became part of this global economic system. And I'm going to stop there, and we'll pick this up in the last video. Okay, see you then.